Hello, this is Vince Lara, Media Relations Specialist at the College of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Illinois. Today I spend a few minutes with Alessandro Rigolon, Assistant Professor in the Recreation, Sport, and Tourism Department at AHS. So Alessandro, tell me, what was the inspiration for your line of research?
Good question. So to be brief, I started, my background is in architecture, so, built environments and places where people, grow and have fun and sort of spend their leisure time. And my coming to the US for a doctoral degree at the University of Colorado, I started to get interested in outdoor spaces, mostly related to schools and playgrounds, from the perspective of the landscape architecture of those places, and then sort of learning about the history of racial segregation and discrimination, in this country. I started to expand that interest from the school playground to neighborhood parks and community spaces, and understand how those community spaces embed some of that history of discrimination over time, and what we can do with policy, with planning, to try to reverse some of those unequal outcomes of those, long-time policies.
But I think in Italy, was there something that inspired you to study? Let's say to study architecture. Even was there, or open space or land use? Even was there something growing up?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated with maps. I've always been a big I used to spend time just looking at maps, like those on paper, those that old school, before I grew up, pre-computer, pre-internet, pre-technology being, present at all times. And so that was one item that made me really, get interested in places and the built environment and, cities and neighborhoods. That was one thing. The other thing is that I was fortunate that my parents, since when I was a kid, took me to travel to mountains and places where recreation and parks and outdoor activities were always available. And so I think to some extent my passion for design and then later on parks and recreation activities comes from what I like to do in my free time, which is mostly free time. That's a good thing to have. That is mostly, spending time hiking with my family, or bike rides, or if the place allows, skiing and snowboarding and all of that. So yeah, I think it was a little bit of a combination between my passion for maps and visualizing things and at the same time what I like to do with my time.
And how did you end up at Denver, at the University of Colorado?
Yeah, good question. So my when I was working as an architect, I had somewhat fallen into an expertise into designing school buildings, because I was working for a firm, and that was one of the things that was, they were designing a lot of those.
This is in Italy before you came to the States?
Yeah, before I came to the States.
And Colorado, was that the first place that you resided in the States?
No, actually. Okay. I did an internship at the University of Washington, Seattle. Okay. Another really beautiful place. But yeah, the Colorado department where I did my PhD, there was a center called Children, Youth, and Environments. And they also had an initiative in Boulder, Colorado, called Growing Up Boulder, that involved engaging children from, basically K-12 education, from elementary to middle school to high school, in designing and planning parks, landscapes, play areas, also all the way to transportation. So we did a lot of community engagement with kids, and so yeah, I sort of, what drove me there was this group of people working on spaces predominantly for kids and working with kids to understand what they need and make it happen.
So did you know anything about Colorado before you went, that it was such an open, beautiful land? I mean, were those factors in your deciding to study there?
Good question. No.
Okay.
I said I was driven more by the place. In fact, it's the only place that I applied for a PhD. It's not that I was desperate. It wasn't like I was just looking for the best fit. And I've always been attracted by the outdoors. And honestly, in Italy, not everybody knows where Colorado is. And at first, I had no idea that it had all of that beauty. I had come to the U.S. before for vacation, but mostly I was in New York for a bit, like everybody, and then I went to the West Coast, and we toured a few national parks, but mostly in California and Utah. And so Colorado wasn't on the map for the natural beauty, but it was definitely something that made me, kept me sane during my PhD. Having access to, beautiful amenities and outdoor spaces.
Now, before you came to Illinois, you were at CSUN, you were at Cal State Northridge, and
Go Matadors.
Right, exactly. And now California's done a great job, especially in Los Angeles. They've done a great job of trying to make these mixed use spaces. Is that something that struck you about your time there, that you noticed that they were building? There's a rail line, and then there's housing above it. So there's these mixed use spaces. Was that something that you noticed, and is that a part of the reason why you picked CSUN, or what was the reasoning there?
Yeah, so California is leading in a lot of things, and they're making a very thoughtful effort to address climate change proactively through certain strategies, including building public transit at a rate that now exceeds any other place in the country, mostly because they were so far behind, right? New York and Chicago have good subway systems.
Yes.
LA didn't have one until I think 1994 was the first. I may be wrong from that date, but it was in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
And so yes, they're now trying to, they're playing catch up, but they're doing, I think a good job at it. And so yeah, I was positively impressed by the leap forward that California and Southern California, specifically have made. It wasn't the primary goal of me being at CSUN. CSUN, I think, was a good starting point for my career because it enabled me to work on my teaching. It's a primary teaching institution. It also enabled me to work with a very diverse student population. It's an Hispanic serving institution. I think 60% or so of the students are Latino or Hispanic, and there's a lot of other minority groups. And so it was really, for the first time, me working with students who were non-white. Colorado is a very white school, and so that was also important for me. And then Los Angeles is a great fit for the research that I do. I'm still actually working on a couple of projects in Los Angeles, actually more than a couple. It's a great spot for a couple of reasons. One, there are strong inequalities, like in many U.S. cities, but LA is, you see on the freeway the truck of the Mexican gardener that barely is holding together, and next to that truck you see that $100,000 Tesla, right next to each other. And it's fascinating how sometimes the freeway can be a democratic place because we're all stuck in traffic, regardless of what car you have.
Yes.
So inequality was one reason. Another reason is that they're revitalizing the Los Angeles River right now. It's been an effort that's been ongoing, but the pace has been faster in the last few years. And so it is a great opportunity to address historical inequities in access to recreation, But B is a threat to communities in terms of gentrification, because now, we're talking about neighborhoods, some certain neighborhoods that are relatively close to downtown that are getting bike infrastructure. You're going to be able to bike, along the river for 51 miles one day.
Wow. All
across the region. There are new transit stations near the river. There are new parks, sport fields and open space. And so those, sort of studying efforts made with a good intention to bring healthy places to those communities that need them so badly. And at the same time, seeing how those well-intended efforts somehow have been backfiring or are starting to backfire. And so studying those issues to understand how we can still implement those well-intended efforts, but without those efforts backfiring and contributing to, of course, significant increases in property values, which in a city that has, I believe, more than 70% of its residents are renters. In a place with 70% renters, or probably not 70, let's say 65 or 64, but still it's a large number. You would, you have a lot of people being at risk of being displaced because of rent increases. And so yes, work that I've been doing there includes, for example, research with nonprofits on how they organize and form coalitions to build more green space and parks in along the river and in neighborhoods that need it the most. I'm currently working on something that's called Participatory Action Research Project, which means that I'm working with a nonprofit called the Trust for Public Land, and they are developing a 30-acre park in Los Angeles County, a little south of downtown. And what we're doing is we're trying to understand what are the strategies that we can try to integrate in the development of this park to make it so that it benefits the residents that have been there for a long time, and it doesn't become a magnet for new development and displacement. It's a tough ride a little bit because it's easy to build a park. Everybody's on board generally. Everybody loves a park. But then when you say, well, we need to do something about housing, and how do we protect renters? How do we protect people like, single income parents? How do we protect people who are elderly and they're on a fixed income, from Social Security? Then it's more complicated because housing is a financial tool to the people use to enrich themselves, and so capping rent for some means lower gains for others, and therefore the conversations become much more political and much more about what is the vision for our cities and societies as somewhere where we should subsidize people to be able to stay in their neighborhood, or is it we're just relying on the free market to take care of business. And so what if people get displaced? They're gonna go somewhere where it's cheaper, and here come the new 20 or 30 something hipsters who can afford now rent that is doubled because now they can charge it.
Right, and that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about was your study on green gentrification.
Yeah,
and that's part of also your focus on social justice, correct?
Yeah.
So were you surprised when you found those results, or did you go in thinking, this is what's happening, and I want to look at 606, for example, in Chicago? So what was the thrust of that study? I guess what was the inspiration for it, and were you surprised ultimately by what you found?
So you're referring to the one on Chicago and the
Correct.
66?
Yes.
Yeah. So let's see. So we already knew that the 606 had brought gentrification to the neighborhoods of Logan Square and Humboldt Park in Chicago. There was a study done by some folks at DePaul University. There's a housing institute, housing studies institute. What we were trying to understand there was sort of why it happened, right? And we're trying to understand what is the role of planning effort or planning process in determining whether a park or a trail in a low-income neighborhood will trigger or not gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we were surprised in hearing was that, piggybacking to what I just said, a couple of moments ago, that it's easy to build a park, that there will be a lot of support. People will use, support in terms of public health, community well-being, but it's not easy to implement any efforts to build or preserve affordable housing to go along with the building of a park. And what we were surprised to see is that there were very few conversations about affordable housing until basically after the project was open. And that was perhaps for a couple of reasons. One, Chicago was just, like everybody else in the country was just, grappling with the 2008 recession. And this planning process started in 2010 when nobody would think that the economy would be doing so well later on in 2015 when the project opened. And then there were other issues such as Chicago, the mayor at the time, still Mayor Rahm Emanuel, due to fiscal issues, that to shut down 50 schools at one point. And so people, I would say the community organizations and the organizers that would generally blow the whistle when gentrification might be happening, I said they were a little busy with something else, and so they weren't able to bring those concerns to the table and have them integrated with the planning for the park itself. So there's this idea of fragmentation, right? That we do one thing at a time. We plan for the park, we plan for transportation, we rarely plan for housing, but we rarely do all these things together at the same time in a way that they're integrated, and that the issues that might arise from planning one thing can be addressed by planning for something else. And that's linked to this, to basically the public sector being very sectoral. And people are specialists in what they do, but oftentimes we lack this big picture that is able to bring everything together. So yeah, that was the main, I think, one of the main things that we were surprised by in that study. Well, we did a follow-up study that is now under peer review, and we examined 10 cities in the U.S. So this was, quantitative. We used, geographic information systems. We mapped parks built between 2000 and 2015, and we sought to understand whether the size of the new park, the location of the new park, and the function of the new park help predict whether the neighborhoods around them will gentrify or not. And when I say size is the acreage, location, we simply measure distance from downtown, knowing that, of course, areas near downtown are already more desirable, whereas areas further away are less desirable. And function, we modeled whether the park was a linear park like the 606 that also has an active transportation component. People can use it to commute, for example, versus other parks that are just, like square shapes or rectangles or other shapes. And so what we found is that size does not matter. Surprisingly, we thought that bigger parks would foster gentrification more, but it wasn't the case. But we found that function really matters. So having a linear park in a neighborhood that is low income has, increases the chances significantly to trigger gentrification. and location also mattered. So parks that were within a certain distance from downtown, depending on the city. New parks that were within certain distance from downtown, depending on the city, were also more likely to trigger gentrification. So that ultimately leads to say that we need to be more careful when we, depending on the location of the parks and on the functions of the new parks, and implement matching affordable housing initiatives that go along subset of park developments in the country. It doesn't mean that all parks will trigger gentrification. Not
Right.
all parks are bad.
Right.
We were trying to disentangle which ones might have a bigger impact versus others, and that's what we found so far.
So the goal, you would say, of the research is to make sure that the housing component is one of the primary factors when deciding what the park's going to look like and where it's going to be and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and one way to do so would be, as they're trying to do in Europe, places like Barcelona, for example, is to build parks in areas that have high shares of public housing or publicly subsidized. So if it's owned by the public, there's no way that people can be displaced unless, as it had happened, unfortunately, in a few places in Chicago, they demolish housing projects and they sell it off and they redevelop them. So yeah, the idea is, one way out of that is, as I said, locating high need areas that also have a high share of housing security, and that could be through publicly owned housing that likely won't be sold or redeveloped for higher incomes.
Understood. Now, do you feel like, how would I say it? So when there are park projects that are in development, is your hope to get a seat at the table as a consultant for these? I mean, is that how you think it should work, or how would you like to see these projects come about?
Good question. Well, I'm an academic. I rarely get involved, with my hands and in these projects. But what I would like to see, and that's the idea of procedural justice, is that community-based organizations that represent the most marginalized people in a community have a seat at the table, and that those parks are planned with and for those long-term residents who have been enduring living in those places before they became cool. Let's put it that way. Who have endured living in those places between public services were established before, maybe before even grocery stores came to the neighborhood, and so they should have a voice at the table. The role of public universities can be in support of those community-based organizations, to provide some training, to build some capacity, to provide mapping, for example, or analysis that that show that yes, there is a risk of displacement. But ultimately, I think the constituents who live in those neighborhoods, they should be the ones who have a place at the table. And unfortunately, I have to say, not every neighborhood has a good community-based organization. So we can't, saying that we rely on those to solve all those issues is not a good idea. But I think when the public fails, when the public fails to do the right thing, communities have organized and done that fairly well in the past. In fact, right now there is a new project in Chicago called the Paseo Trail, down in the neighborhoods of Pilsen and Little Village, and those are Mexican American neighborhoods. Pilsen is already started to gentrify, Little Village is not. But the bottom line is that this Paseo Trail will be a 4-mile trail, so longer than the 606. Will be less artsy or less designy, if that's a word, meaning that it will be at grade, whereas the 606 is elevated. But it already raised significant gentrification concerns, and so the community is organized fairly well so far, and they got the city of Chicago to pass it's called an affordable requirements ordinance that will require new developments to dedicate, I think, up to 20% of new units to affordable rental units. And so sort of interesting how they might have learned from the 606, that it's a few miles north, and then they've organized in different ways. And the city this time seems to, be aware of the issue and has done something to be proactive and do these things before the parks open. Because when the parks open, it's already too late, because it's visible, it's there. Realtors will, advertise it. They will, they already charge more for housing when it's open and when it's visible.
Sure.
And so yeah, the acting early piece is very important, and it's been done. Or fortunately, it is under current work for the Paseo Trail in Chicago, which some have called the 606 South. Hopefully, it's not going to be the same outcome. But
in light of your research, has anyone reached out to you? Have any community organizations reached out, especially after your research was publicized?
Yeah, actually, so the participatory action research project I'm doing in Los Angeles County right now is a result of that, and so the Trust for Public Land with the Los Angeles office, and they reached out to me and we engaged in conversations on how to build the park that we're working on. At the same time, conduct some analysis and interviews and work with residents to understand what are some of the tools that we can ask the city to implement alongside the development of the park. And as I said, it's complicated, but it it's an ongoing effort that we're undertaking, and it's some days we make progress, other days we go back to square one. But yeah, it's an interesting ongoing effort. Actually, yeah, I've been contacted by a couple of other people in Chicago later on who are working on the Paseo Trail, which I just mentioned, now that you made me think about it. And so yeah, we had a conversation on the phone, and they are, I'm not based in Chicago, right? So if I were to be based in Chicago, it would be probably easier to be more involved on a weekly basis on some of those efforts. But I plan, I go there maybe like every other month for either research or other activities. And so I am, I have some connections there. It's but I haven't been as involved as I would like to be in directly helping those organizations achieve their goals. That might change in the future, but for now it's been some limited contact. But I'm as I said, the project in Los Angeles is really exciting for that reason, because we have the opportunity not only to publish high quality research, but also hopefully to help the city embark in good choices about how to make green space benefit their current residents and not just to attract new development from the outside.
My thanks to Alessandro Rigolon. This has been A Few Minutes With.